Hola! Greetings and salutations, folks. It is I, your host, Cinema Kane, or as you may call me today, Cinema Freddy. Ha 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 ha! Today we are having a very special episode of Movie House Matinee, the Cinema Kane podcast, as we talk about the entirety of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. So in the limelight today, let's take a look at the entirety of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. I'm sorry, I just can't do that. Can't keep that up. Wow. That was fun though, right? So, yeah. Nightmare on Elm Street. I got really into the Elm Street films shortly after seeing Scream in 1996, which was my first horror movie. And I got into Scream, I got into Scream, which led to Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, because they all got name dropped in Scream. And the Elm Street franchise is up there for me. It used to be my number one for a very brief time until I saw Halloween. Then it became my number two franchise, and honestly, it's worked its way down to number three over the years. I don't know if it's just my age, but as fun as the Elm Street films are, I just am to the point where I enjoy the Friday the 13th films, and more importantly, the Halloween films more. So, today, let's talk about Nightmare on Elm Street. Nightmare on Elm Street is one of those movies that I watch, and I think about, how did no one see the potential? And what I mean by that is, Wes Craven shopped this movie around from studio to studio for years before Bob Shaye of New Line Cinema was like, yeah, you know what? We're going to give you $1 million and you can make this movie. And they shot the original Elm Street for $1 million, which when you think about the budget for something like Halloween, which was like, I want to say $100,000, a little over $100,000. And then you look at the budget for Friday the 13th, which was about $1 million, maybe $1.5 million, to make Elm Street, which was, in my opinion, a bit more complex to do, for such a minimal budget, pretty impressive. The Elm Street franchise as a whole is a unique animal, because each installment seems to add to the complexity of how the movies are made, with the exception of part 2, but we'll get to that when we get to that. They also have something that a lot of franchises don't, which is they keep adding to the lore. The mythology of Freddy and who he is as a character keeps getting added to with each new installment. In the original, he's definitely more of just a slasher in a nightmare, but with a human backstory that almost makes him sympathetic until you realize what his deplorable crime is, and then you go, oh, wait a minute, the parents were right. I love the original Nightmare on Elm Street. To me, it's still the best. You take a character like Fred Krueger and you put him in the janky hat with the glove and the Christmas sweater. I know I need a Christmas sweater, don't I? Anyway, it makes him more menacing. And apparently the reason that the red and green stripes were chosen for Freddy was because of the fact that he wanted, or Wes Craven wanted the character to be something that our minds would, that would mess with our minds. And red and green are apparently two of the hardest colors for the human eye to differentiate between. So he's already playing with us psychologically just from that perspective, but then you add to it the idea that this guy can come at you in your dreams, in your nightmares. It's just a brilliant idea. Wes Craven got the idea for Fred Krueger based on a drunk he saw outside of his bedroom window when he was a child. He was on the second floor of his house and he was looking out, and this guy in a hat similar to Freddy's scared the crap out of Wes Craven, and so that's where he got the inspiration for the hat. The glove, Wes wanted something that was going to be primal, that we would instinctively fear. And of course, you know, there was a time when there were massive predators that had massive claws that came after humans. So why not do something primal for Freddy's Instrument of Death? The fact that it was homemade and done in Freddy's boiler room simply made it to where it was that much more menacing, because it meant he took the time to think about what would strike fear into the hearts of his victims. Freddy as a villain is complex and is brought to life by the great Robert Englund, and I absolutely love this guy. His interviews over the years, the time he takes out with fans, he's just such a charismatic guy, and he seems like such the polar opposite of the character he is most well known for portraying, which is a good thing, because let's hope that no actors are in fact like the characters they are portraying on screen, although Ryan Reynolds in Deadpool is definitely starting to make me wonder. Elm Street's first installment is one of those movies where everything had to be right for it to work. And I mean, again, the theme for the movie is a very simple piano note thing like they did with Halloween. Da, 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 da. It's beautifully haunting and simplistic, and it really works for the film. And it's done on a synthesizer keyboard. And it's got that little bit of electronic to it, which makes it eerie and otherworldly. Almost something like a theremin. And then you've got the cast. Heather Langenkamp as Nancy, probably one of the best final girls in a horror franchise ever, right up there with Jamie Lee Curtis. And then you've got Amanda Weiss, who plays Tina, Freddy's first victim in the first film, and she may only be on screen for a short time, but she's memorable. She, of course, had many credits in the 80s, including Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Better Off Dead, Nightmare on Elm Street, and she's just, I mean, they're both just phenomenal actresses. Nick Corey, who I am unfamiliar with a lot of his work, I do remember seeing him, ironically enough, on an episode of Murder, She Wrote many, many years ago, and finally, introducing Johnny Depp. I don't care what anyone says. Personally, I believe that Depp is one of our best actors on the scene today, and the fact that Hollywood has drummed him out simply because his ex-wife lied about him, which was proven in a court of law, I might add. It's just a travesty to think about. And so, if anyone is still putting down Johnny Depp after all of that, I mean, he had exes come to his defense. That's all I'm saying. I love the original Nightmare on Elm Street for its creativity, its innovative makeup, the innovative idea of who the killer was, the cool idea that he could kill you in your dreams. All of this makes the original Nightmare on Elm Street just absolutely phenomenal, and you totally need to check it out. When it comes to Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, this movie gets a bad rep. Do I think it is the worst installment in the franchise? Yes. But I also think that it's not nearly as bad as some people like to say it is. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Freddy's Revenge is one of those movies that you have a successful franchise or a successful movie and you immediately want to capitalize on it. That's what Bob Shaye did. He said, okay, we got to strike while the iron's hot. We're going to make a sequel immediately. Wes Craven wasn't ready to make a sequel. He had no idea what he was going to do with a sequel. He was approached, but when he started taking too much time with it, dragging his feet, as Bob Shaye saw it, he went to a different director and a different writer and said, okay, make me something with Freddy. And that's kind of what they did. Elm Street 2 feels tonally different from the entire franchise. And, you know, there's a great documentary called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, and it's all about the gay undertones of Elm Street 2. I have no problem with the film in that regard. I definitely didn't pick up on it when I was 13 years old. It was not until really watching the film later in life and going, oh, wait a minute, that I realized that there were, in fact, gay undertones in Elm Street 2. The biggest issue I have with Elm Street 2 is that it is so tonally different from the rest of the franchise. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in a lot of cases. Like if you look at, say, Friday the 13th Part 5 versus the rest of the franchise, it's definitely tonally different. And yet somehow it works because it's an imposter Jason. In many ways, you could argue that Elm Street 2 is kind of like the Friday the 13th Part 5 of the Elm Street franchise, because Freddy's doing something in Elm Street 2 that he doesn't do in any other installment. He is literally trying to take over the main character and use his body as a host to get back to the real world where he can kill at will using this guy's body. And, you know, it's unique to say the least. I'll say that for it. There's haunting imagery in it. It's definitely one of the grittier installments of the Elm Street franchise, and it feels scarier on some levels, which I can applaud it for, because Freddy became such a comic relief character from the third one on that the first two are really the only times I can say he feels truly menacing or scary. So, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge from 1985 is definitely worth a watch, but not top tier Freddy in my opinion. I do enjoy the film. I just don't think that it's as good as the Elm Street franchise could get or will get. That honor still goes to number 1 in my opinion. Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors. You get a kick-ass Dokken song as your theme. I mean, who doesn't love We're the Dream Warriors? I mean, it's a great song. But then you also get a cool idea of a film. An idea where we bring back our lead character, Nancy, from the first film. We put her as a psychologist in a mental hospital where a group of teenagers are all sharing a delusion of a killer, Freddy. And we have her trying to help the kids by showing them how to fight back in their dreams. Cool idea. You got a great cast in this one. Robert Englund really brings his A game. You get classic one-liners like "Welcome to Prime Time, bitch." It's the first time you really see the joking, sarcastic Freddy. You also get to see what I've heard dubbed as the first MTV Nightmare on Elm Street. And there were at least 2 of those, possibly even 3, depending on how you feel about Part 5. But Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, is such a cool concept. And you have a idea here that was partially constructed by Wes Craven. And then Chuck Russell and his writing partner came in and they manipulated it. Originally, it was going to be a much darker film. And then Chuck Russell came in and kind of lightened it up a little bit and made it more of a horror comedy. The coolest thing about Elm Street 3 is it was the first time they really had a big budget, and as a result, they used that budget to great effect by saying, what can we do with Freddy? He's in your dreams. What can we do to make the nightmares really stand out, make them really unique? It's the first time we see the interior of Freddy's version of the Elm Street house, 1428 Elm Street. And it's definitely one of those things where you go, oh, they thought a long time about this. Because from Kristen being eaten by a snake to Joey hanging over a fire pit with tongues at his wrist, I mean, Philip getting used like a marionette puppet. All of these effects are done with just absolute creativity and imagination behind them, and they work so well. You know, I've always loved the illustrated, painted artwork of the Elm Street posters. But Dream Warriors has always stood out to me as one of the best posters in the franchise because of the idea of it being Freddy's extended hand, and each one of the Dream Warriors is on one blade, ready to take Freddy on as they're heading toward Freddy's face. Dream Warriors is also the first time they start to go into more lore about who Freddy is, and we find out that he was the bastard son of 100 maniacs, and that his mother was a nun, Amanda Kruger. And you start to actually realize that this guy was bad news from the jump. It wasn't just something he grew into. He was conceived in tragedy and became a tragedy for others. I love Dream Warriors. It's a great installment in the franchise, and it kicked off the next two films in a great way, because now onto Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, we get Alice, the only other protagonist to be featured more than one time outside of Nancy, played by Lisa Wilcox, and she's great. I had such a crush on her when I was a teenager. I thought she was so cute, and still do. In fact, I think she's a very nice looking lady. Anyway, Dream Master is one of those movies where you find yourself wanting another Dream Warriors, and you get it to a degree, but not in the way you were thinking. The nightmares are just as creative. This time around, you've got Rennie Harlan, who is still a working director today, and he is bringing his A game with this one. He got the job because he started talking about the fact that he's had nightmares since he was a child, and he has them all the time still, apparently. And the cast is just superb. You get a new actress Tuesday night coming in to play Kristen this time around. You get the survivors from Dream Warriors back together, and Alice is our new lead character all of a sudden, because Kristen dies at about the 30-minute mark into the film. And when Alice absorbs Kristen's powers, all of a sudden she's able to absorb all the powers of her friends as they're taken out one by one by Freddy. And you get great montage. You got a great soundtrack in this one, just like you had in the previous one. But again, they add to the mythology because they talk about a nursery rhyme that Alice heard as a child that she uses against Freddy to kill him in the end of this movie. The effects are great again, and Elm Street 4 is highly ranked on my personal list, but we'll get into that at the end of the overview. Now, Elm Street 5, a lot of people are divided on, because some people really love Elm Street 5. I'm one of them. Some hate it. Some are indifferent about it. Elm Street 5 is a movie that, here's the thing, I do not like watching franchises out of order. Elm Street 5 was the first one I ever saw. And I can even remember recording it off of TV and thinking to myself, am I going to understand what's going on here? Newsflash, I kind of didn't, but it didn't really matter because I thought it was cool. The style of artwork in this I would almost describe as gothic. And there are even a few scenes in this one where Freddy's classic red and green sweater actually look more like they're orange and red instead. Don't know why that was done. Thought it was an interesting idea though. And if you'll notice, as we progress in the franchise, the makeup is almost always different. Robert Englund gives a couple of performances in this one. One of which is that he plays one of the 100 maniacs that rapes Amanda Kruger in Elm Street 5, which I thought was a beautiful touch by the director. This one was directed by Stephen, I want to say Hopkins is his name, but he would later go on to make Lost in Space in 1999 from New Line Cinema. And this was one of his earlier films, and it's really good for what it is, because he decided to kind of push the envelope. What can I get away with? What can I do in this long-running franchise? Because you're in the middle, you're in the 5th installment. One of the things he gives us this time around, every franchise loves to have a baby, like, Baby Yoda or Baby Beetlejuice, as we've seen most recently. Well, what about Baby Freddy? Yeah, Elm Street 5 gives us Baby Freddy. And the Dream Child, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child, does not refer to Baby Freddy as the Dream Child. No, the Dream Child, in this case, is Alice's unborn child, whom Freddy is feeding the souls of her fallen friends to in an effort to try and corrupt the fetus to become like him. It's a great installment with an interesting, cool idea, and it's got yet another iconic illustrated painted poster. Again, I'm going to throw up images while I'm editing this of what these posters look like, because they are so freaking cool. But Elm Street 5, in my opinion, doesn't get the respect it deserves with regard to the entries on this list. I feel like it's a good film overall, perfectly cast with good music and a lot of fun, especially with the ideas that were presented here. Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Now, if you know anything about the Friday the 13th franchise, then you'll know if they put the word final in there, it's not really true. They had 2 in the Friday the 13th franchise with the word final in there, and they never had the word final up until now in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare is the most comedic we've ever seen Freddy been. Yes, he's been a wisecracking, smart-ass character for a while now, but Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare is our first time seeing Freddy just be kind of nutso, balls to the wall crazy. He's a great character in this one because he does so much with his body language, with the humor that was input into the character for this one. And Robert Englund just does not get enough praise, in my opinion. He is the Elm Street franchise. If it was not for him, you couldn't do as many movies as you did. This time around, Rachel Taylor, I believe I'm saying that right, is the director. She was a producer from like Elm Street 2 through 4 or 5, and she came to this one specifically to direct it. I want to say she may have co-written it too. She had been working on some John Waters films over at New Line, Crybaby and Hairspray, and she brought the John Waters sensibility to the Elm Street franchise with this installment. And you get cameos from Johnny Depp doing a drug PSA while a character trips out on the couch. And as that character is tripping out watching Johnny Depp do a drug PSA, Freddy comes in to interrupt Johnny Depp doing a drug PSA. It's meta horror in a meta horror movie. You gotta love it. Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare introduces even more mythology. We find out who Freddy was raised by. He was raised by an abusive, drunk stepfather, in this case played by Alice Cooper. We find out that he liked to torture small animals as a child. We find out that he had a daughter and a wife who he killed his wife while he was going on his rampage in the Elm Street neighborhood. And we find out that his daughter didn't even realize that he was her father. And It is a movie where each character is there strictly to serve a purpose of getting one character from A to B. I enjoy Freddy's Dead for the most part, but I do think it's one of the lesser installments because they cared more about the humor and less about the scary. Just my opinion. And I don't feel like it was nearly as creative as some of the previous installments like Part 3 or Part 4. The Power Glove joke does still get me, and I love that particular moment where he goes, "Hey, you forgot about the Power Glove!" Ha ha ha. I'm a huge fan of this franchise still to this day. As a fan of this franchise, I can definitely say that Freddy's Dead is not the end-all be-all when it comes to the Elm Street franchise. So, now we're on to true meta horror. 2 years before Scream, Wes Craven would write and direct Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Technically, officially, the final installment of the original Elm Street franchise. Wes Craven's New Nightmare is a movie that takes the idea of what if Freddy was sort of a mythical creature in our world that was held at bay by people's fear of a fictitious Freddy Krueger character. But now that they're not making the movies anymore, Freddy's trying to come out from his dimension into our world to wreak serious havoc in the guise of Freddy Krueger. Heather Langenkamp's back. John Saxon, that played her father in Part 1 and Part 3, is back. Miko Hughes, I believe is how you say his name. He played Little Gage in Pet Sematary. He was regular on Full House. He was in Kindergarten Cop. He plays Heather Langenkamp's son Dylan in this film. You got Nick Corey and Tuesday Night from the original Elm Street and from Elm Street 4 playing background characters in a funeral scene at one point. The setup of this film is very cool because you get this whole idea of what if our greatest fears were in fact real and were trying to attack us when we stopped having outlets for our fears. Wes Craven had multiple drafts of Wes Craven's New Nightmare, one of which included an insomniac Wes Craven who had cut his eyelids off because he was feverishly typing a new Elm Street script so that they could trap Freddy back into the dream world. Well, in this case, Wes is still doing that, but he's not taking it quite to that dark place. And it really works, and you can see why Wes Craven was the perfect director to make a movie like Scream when you watch Wes Craven's New Nightmare. If you've never seen any of these movies, I highly recommend watching 1 through 7 because the next two may or may not be included as, well, I mean, I know they're not included as canon to the main Elm Street franchise. So the next installment is Freddy vs. Jason. Take your bets. I've already talked about this in my Friday the 13th overview, but I enjoyed Freddy vs. Jason. It's the same director as Bride of Chucky. He immersed himself in the first Nightmare on Elm Street and in the first Friday the 13th. I'm not sure if he actually delved deeper than that, but he primarily wanted to take inspiration from those original films. I feel like he would have had to have, because it feels more like a Part 3 or Part 4 with the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff that's involved, and the Friday the 13th stuff feels more like the Paramount era stuff than it does the New Line era stuff. I love Elm Street as a franchise, and I like Freddy vs. Jason. I saw that movie twice in theaters when it came out, and I bought the DVD when it first came out. I bought the Blu-ray, and now I've got it in the box set with my Friday the 13th franchise. And you know, as much as I enjoy that film, I rewatched it recently. And there are definitely issues with it, because at times it can't decide if it wants to be a Nightmare on Elm Street film or if it wants to be a Friday the 13th film. And I know there are going to be some of you out there that say, well, it's both. And while that is true, I feel like you could have found a tonal waypoint that would have allowed it to feel like its own thing set within those worlds. I enjoyed Freddy vs. Jason when it first came out. I still enjoy it, but I definitely feel like it could have had more involved with it. I do like the fact that, once again, they expand on Freddy's dream powers, dream set, if you will. Okay, I just realized I forgot one of my notes here about Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare, that I forgot to bring up. They expanded the mythology in Freddy's Dead about him being a dream demon. That's brought up again in Freddy vs. Jason, that he's a dream demon. And that, again, makes for interesting fodder to play with. Like, how could we have done more with the whole dream demon concept in Freddy vs. Jason? How could we have done more with the idea of zombie Jason and the fact that he is still called to avenge his mother's death? Why is Jason lying dormant at Crystal Lake waiting for Freddy to call him back to life? I mean, there are questions that should have been answered, and I'm notorious for telling people it's a movie, just leave it alone. However, I do like a little bit of logic sometime with my movies, and I feel like it wouldn't have taken much to have given us a little bit of a mythology to explain certain things. Like, you know, maybe Freddy had a book that would have allowed him to, you know, resurrect Jason in such a way. I don't know. I'm spitballing ideas for a movie that doesn't, for a different version of that movie, I guess. And finally, we come to the last installment currently of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, the 2010 reboot. Where do I begin? I like Jackie Earle Haley as an actor. I like a lot of these actors as actors. Katie Cassidy and Cal Gaunier, I forget his name, Rooney Mara. They're great actors. Jackie Earle Haley was an interesting take on Freddy, but the issues I had were they couldn't decide if they wanted to hide in the shadows like the original Elm Street franchise did, or if they just wanted to blatantly put it out there. And they decided to go with blatantly putting it out there. So in the remake of Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy is not just a child killer, but a child toucher. And it's kind of disgusting, to the point that you find yourself watching the film going, okay, really? They went there? And you're not, the little bit of quote unquote sympathy you might have had for Freddy in 1984 before you knew everything else about him is gone. Because you immediately go, okay, anyone that would do such a thing to a child is not deserving of my sympathy, and therefore just no. So that's kind of my biggest issue with the remake of Nightmare on Elm Street. I just feel like they should not have gone that dark with the remake. The movie itself, I've only ever seen a handful of times, like maybe 2 or 3 times, whereas the rest of the franchise, I've seen numerous times. I'm to the point now where I say, you know, if you can get away with making a good remake, you're in a certain camp, like, you know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, both great remakes. But there are times where you get an Elm Street remake and you just go, oh, what were they thinking? Overall, I love the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and I hope you've enjoyed this walk through the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. If you did, don't forget to click like. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click that bell notification so you know every time Cinema Kane, has a new video uploaded. And don't forget to share this on all your social media platforms in an effort to help me grow my channel. And I'll see you next time at the video store.